Edward VI. When the great Henry VIII lay dying, his chief thought was to secure the safety of his young son, Edward. So he named 16 persons, of whom the chief were the boy's uncles Edward and Thomas Seymour, to carry out his King Henry's intentions. The little king and his sister, Elizabeth, wept bitterly when they heard of their father's death. When they went to the Tower a day or two later, though Elizabeth was still very sad, Edward, who was only 9 years old, clapped his hands with delight when the cannons were fired off to greet him as king. His council received him with bent knees and kisses on his hand, and the words, "God save your grace." The boy had been told what he must do. He took off his cap and said with pretty courtesy, "We heartily thank you, my lords all, and hereafter, in all that you shall have to do with us for any suit or cause, you shall be heartily welcome." Little Edward, from his infancy, had been crammed with teaching. When he was 6 years old, he was taken from his nurses, and 2 tutors were appointed, who worked the poor child so hard that at 8 years old he was able to write Latin letters to his father. He was capable of keeping a diary for himself from the time of his accession, stiff, dry, and without character, as could only be expected in a mere child of 9 years old, but very curious. He was a beautiful boy, with blue eyes, light hair, and the fair skin of the royal line, and his nature seems to have been very docile and agreeable, though not without a certain sort of obstinacy, such as could hardly fail to be developed in a little scholar king, who would have been the prize boy at a grammar school. He had a mighty conception of his own dignity. His uncle Thomas Seymour kept the king hard at his books, and his uncle Edward Seymour got the king to make him Duke of Somerset. This duke was a very proud and greedy man. He built a splendid palace for himself in London, destroying for its sake the parish church of St. Mary's in the Strand, and pulling down the houses of several bishops. The pleasure grounds were to have reached from the Strand to St. Paul's Cathedral. The chapel of the dead in St. Paul's churchyard was pulled down to make room for the pleasure grounds, and the bones of the dead were scattered to the fields. Edward's stepmother, Catherine Parr, had charge of him and his sister Elizabeth, and also of his cousin Lady Jane Grey, who was the same age as the little king. Edward was fond of his stepmother, who seems to have been very kind in a rough sort of way. Edward had been brought up to be a Protestant, and in his reign a great many things that make the church service beautiful were declared to be unlawful, and the king commanded a new prayer book to be made, which was very much disliked by the people, and led to riots and fights in almost every county in England. There had not been such rebellion since the days of Wat Tyler. But all the rebellions in Edward VI's time were not about the prayer book, by any means, for the people of England were, as usual, being oppressed and ill-treated by the rich, and at this time the rich had found out a new means of injuring them. You must know that there had been, as far back as anyone could remember, large pieces of grassland and woodland, which did not belong to any particular owner, but to the common people. And these were called commons, or common land. They were of the greatest value to the people, because any poor man who had a horse or a cow or a sheep could turn his beast out to feed on the common land. And his beasts got just as much food off the common land as they would have done if their owner had been able to fence a little plot and call it his very own. But the rich lords could not bear to think of the poor people having good pasture land. So they used to enclose a field or a wood here and there with a fence, and then say it was their own, and that the common people had no right to it. There was a great rebellion against this theft, for it was nothing less, and it would have been well for the poor of England if that rebellion had been successful. As it was, it took 7,500 men to put it down. But they did at last succeed in forcing the poor people to submit, to have their lands taken from them. The Church Catechism was written about this time. It would have been well if these greedy, idle, rich men had learnt their catechism and put it into practice. For you know the Catechism says that each man is not to covet or desire other men's goods, but to learn and labour truly to get his own living, and to do his duty in that state of life to which it shall please God to call him. And a man's living should be what he earns by his own work, not what he can steal from other people by enclosing their lands or otherwise. The people in England were growing more and more clever in most things, and it was soon after this that the greatest plays in the world were written. But in the reign of Edward VI, there were no plays such as you see now in theatres. The first kind of play was called a miracle play. It was generally acted on a platform out of doors, and acted mostly at first by priests. They used to act some story taken out of the Old Testament, and the play went on for many days together. Every nobleman of distinction kept his own company of players to amuse him and his friends. Then came what we call mysteries, and these represent something taken out of the New Testament. Then they invented a new kind of play called a morality, in which persons dressed up to represent virtues and vices, and came in and made long speeches, which must very often have been exceedingly tiresome. Rough little plays, something like the harlequinades of the pantomimes, and called interludes, were introduced between the acts of the miracle play, or morality. Masks were a very gorgeous sort of play, with not much acting, but a great deal of dressing and ornament, so that they were more of a show than a play. These were given at court and in private houses, and the young king was very fond of all these entertainments. Edward VI did some very cruel things. He ordered his uncle, the Duke of Somerset, who had always been very kind to him, to be executed. The Duke had offended some great lords, and they persuaded the king that he ought to be made to die. But the poor people loved him, and the laws that were made while he was protector were meant for England's good. On the morning that he was to be beheaded, a great many people had assembled to show their respect for him. Suddenly the sound of a horse's hoofs was heard, and the people hoped that the king had repented of his cruelty and sent a pardon to his uncle at the last moment. But it was not so. The king had only sent a messenger to see that the execution was carried out. Then the people groaned and were sad. The Duke begged that they would be quiet and still, because he wished to make a brave end, and the sight of their sorrow for him almost unmanned him. "For," he said, "through your tumult you might trouble me, for though the spirit is willing, the flesh is weak. And if you are quiet, I shall be much more quiet." So he died. In spite of his pride and extravagance, he had good qualities, and the people mourned for him. King Edward's health was growing worse, and he was persuaded by his other uncle to make a will, leaving the crown not to either of his sisters, Mary and Elizabeth, but to his cousin, Lady Jane Grey. And this foolish will cost many lives and much unhappiness. The best thing Edward did in his reign was the founding of grammar schools in many parts of the country. One school you all know. It is Christ's Hospital, called the Blue Coat School, which was established to feed and clothe 400 poor children, and the boys who are taught there now still wear the dress which boys wore in Edward's reign. Edward the Sixth's father had taken away the lands of the monks and given them to his lords. Some of the monks had been wicked and selfish, but many of them had been kind and good, especially to the poor. And while the monasteries or monks' houses flourished in England, poor beggars were always sure of help from the monks. But when the monks were turned out, and they themselves had to become beggars, and the poor, who they had helped, wandered about the country with no one to lend them a helping hand, the numbers of people who had no work, and who had in former times been helped by the monks, were so great that later on it was necessary to make a law for the relief of the poor. This was well meant at first, but led to a great deal of unhappiness, partly because the help given to the poor under the Poor Law was forced help, for which people had to be taxed, whereas the help that the old monks had given them had been from charity, the generous gift of love. It was to provide for the children of these poor people, who suffered so much from the loss of the monks' charity, that Edward VI founded his schools. Pins are said by some to have been invented in the previous reign, but as a matter of fact, they were introduced at a much earlier period. Before pins were invented, ladies used to use little skewers of bone or wood to fasten their clothes. As for needles, they were tremendously valuable. One needle in a house was considered a precious possession, and was handed down from mother to daughter. There were not any made in England at that time. They were all bought from abroad. A very different state of things from the present, when a little girl takes a fresh needle to put a stitch in her doll's clothes, and when she has put in a stitch promptly drops the needle into some place convenient for running into the hands or feet of other people. Edward VI died when he was only 16, and then came dreadful trouble, brought about by the foolish will he had made. For Lady Jane Grey was made queen, by her friends, though much against her will. Then only 20 days afterwards she was obliged to go back to her own house, and a little later on both she and her husband were executed by order of Edward's sister Mary, who had been proclaimed queen.